Hey everyone, we're going to talk about Rome tonight. The empire that took over half of the known world and still had time to be very petty about it. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is about is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming from all over the world. Now turn down the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to make a soft noise in the background. Take it easy as we go on our journey tonight. When Rome took a queen, they didn't see a defeated woman sitting quietly in a tent, thinking about how everything went wrong. Rome saw a logistical nightmare in a crown. Queens were not normal prisoners. They couldn't be processed, put in order, and then forgotten about like a sack of captured spears. They were political problems on foot with great posture and terrible timing. Rome liked things to be in order. Rome loved to have a hierarchy. Rules were important to Rome, and a queen who was caught broke a lot of them. By just being there, she had been in charge. She had led armies. People had done what she said without question, which made her suspicious. Even worse, she did all of this without Roman's permission, paperwork, or supervision. Honestly, the nerve. Rome didn't see a queen as a threat because she could fight. She was dangerous because people trusted her. Soldiers do what they're told. People who follow believe. It is much harder to kill a belief, and Rome didn't want to leave any unfinished business lying around. This is why Rome didn't treat queens like normal prisoners. People could sell, enslave, or kill a normal prisoner without much thought. A queen needed to hold meetings and talk. Someone always said, "We can't just kill her, people are watching." Rome was many things, but it was never subtle when there were people around. Rome was also good at turning personal tragedies into lessons for the whole community. A queen who had been caught was a gift, not to her, of course, but to the empire's messaging department. People could show her off, talk about her, and even whisper about her, and pointed at. Rome could say without saying a word, "This is what happens when you try to rule on your own." And Rome loved a good image. A queen stripped of power but kept alive was far more effective than a corpse. A dead queen could become a martyr. A living, humiliated queen became a warning label with legs. There was also the issue of ego. Rome didn't like it when people questioned it, and it really didn't like it when someone who wore a crown did it and didn't have to answer to a Roman man with a clipboard. The punishment had to be complete. It had to be embarrassing and something that would stick in people's minds. So once a queen was caught, her fate was no longer about justice, mercy, or even getting back at someone. It turned into a performance review done by an empire with great attendance. She was no longer in charge. She taught me something. Rome liked power to be organized. Power went up, stopped in Rome, and didn't ask questions. Romans didn't like anything that wasn't inside that structure, and they didn't like rivals more than anything else. Ruler who seemed to be doing well without the help of the Romans. Kings were annoying, but I knew them well. For hundreds of years, Rome had to deal with kings. They were easy to guess. They fought, talked things over, paid their respects, and eventually lost wars in an orderly way. But queens made things even more uncomfortable. Not because Rome had never seen strong women before. Yes, it did, but a queen ruling on her own broke a lot of unspoken rules at once. A queen in charge said that authority didn't need Roman approval, Roman bloodlines, or Roman institutions. Even worse, it said that loyalty could exist outside of Rome's carefully controlled ecosystem. From the Roman point of view, this was not a rebellion. This was ideological pollution. Rome didn't officially say, "We don't like women in power." Rome was too smart for that. Instead, Roman writers quietly painted queens as unnatural, too much, emotional, or dangerously charming. Anything that made it seem like their rule was an exception rather than a real one. System. This had less to do with gender and more to do with power. Rome didn't like us known to anyone who made it seem like they could rule without them. And let's be honest, Rome didn't like competition either. A queen who ruled well, inspired loyalty, and fought against Rome made the empire look weak for a short time. Rome did not fail. Rome did what had to be done. So when Rome caught such a queen, they saw a chance not only to punish her, but also to change the story. Rome could say, "See, this deal was always going to work out," when they caught her. Unstable. Her humiliation made the idea that sovereignty outside of Rome was not just doomed stronger, it was humiliating. This is why the Roman were so careful when they punished queens. They weren't cruel acts done on the spur of the moment. They were lectures that were given while chained up. Rome wanted other rulers, whether they were men or women, to see what happened and learn from it without needing to be told again. Rome never showed fear, but it was there, fear that authority might be able to exist on its own, fear that loyalty might last after being conquered, fear that someone somewhere might see a queen stand up to Rome and think, maybe we could do that too. Rome didn't punish queens who were caught because they had lost. Rome punished them because they had once been in charge and done a good job. For a queen who was an enemy of Rome, being captured was not the end of the story. It was the time for paperwork. The war could be over, the army ran away, and the city burned, but Rome was just getting started. Rome never rushed to punish people it liked to enjoy them. When a queen was captured alive, her fate stopped being about what happened on the battlefield and became about scheduling. She was no longer fighting. Rome, like any good empire, didn't waste assets, and she was one of them. The queens who were captured were moved carefully, not gently, but just enough to make sure they got there safely. If the lesson ends on the road, you can't hold a public lesson. Guards were told to keep her alive, in plain sight, and clearly defeated. This wasn't. Please have mercy. This was getting ready. Rome also knew that time was a weapon. It could take weeks or months for someone to be caught and punished in public. People talked about things during that time of silence. Did she live? Did they kill her? Was she being shown off in the streets of Rome? Fear worked long before chains ever clinked. Roman officials, on the other hand, were arguing about what her role would be. Would they march her in a victory? kept alive as a bargaining chip, then quietly erased. Rome liked choices. A queen who was caught gave the empire some freedom, and Rome valued freedom almost as much as it valued making examples. The queen thought that this waiting time was punishment in and of itself. No information, no schedule, no power. She had led armies and people, but now her future depended on men who talked about her fate over wine and complaints about the government. It was power taken away from it. Rome had learned from experience that killing people right away made them martyrs. Songs, stories, and other things were inspired by martyrs. Rebellions that are hard to deal with. Rome liked it colder. A queen who was alive and in limbo sent a stronger message. Resistance doesn't end quickly or in a neat way. During this time, Rome was also able to break down her identity. People didn't pay attention to titles. People didn't care about royal status. People didn't call her a ruler. They called her the woman, the captive, or the barbarian. Words were important. Rome was already changing her story before anyone else saw it. The queen had either come back in chains or in. She was no longer shown as a leader who had stood up to Rome in silence. She was used as an example to show that going against Rome was a bad idea in the long run. The end was not capture, it was the setup. A triumph sounds nice to people today. Something with applause, smiles, and maybe a nice speech. Rome's victory was none of those things. People who thought that humiliating others was a public service planned the victory parade. Rome turned conquest into theater with a triumph. People gathered in the streets, opened temples, and marched the spoils of war at the center of it all. Treasure, weapons, strange animals, and most importantly, enemies who were still alive after being beaten. For a queen who had been captured, the victory was not an honor. It was the most carefully planned insult you could think of. She was led through Rome behind the winning general, sometimes in chains, and sometimes with symbolic restraints that made sure everyone knew she was no longer in charge. The crowd didn't need directions. They knew what they had to do right away. This is the part where you stare, whisper, laugh, and remember that Rome always wins. People in Rome loved stories that were told through pictures. The queen was there to make a big difference from the general who was riding high, wrapped in purple, and pretending to be almost divine for the day. She walked, he rode, she went after, he was in charge. It was so clear what the message said that it didn't need to be translated. She looked like she was from another country on purpose. Roman victories highlighted distinction. Odd clothes, jewelry that isn't familiar, strange hairstyles, all of which were meant to make her look like she came from a lower world that had been neatly folded into Roman rule. Rome didn't just take over land, it took over stories. The crowd was important. Rome could have punished her in private. It didn't want to. A punishment that wasn't seen was a missed chance. The humiliation would be heard far beyond the city because tens of thousands of people were watching. People would tell stories. People who traveled would say them again. Future rebels would see her before, ever picking up a sword, and Rome liked the wait. The victory often came long after the war was over. The queen had been waiting for a while, knowing what was going to happen, but not being able to stop it. The anticipation made the cruelty worse. Rome did not yell during victories. It didn't have to. Chains, silence, and contrast did all the work. The queen's job was easy: be living proof of how inevitable Rome was. The lesson had already been taught by the end of the triumph. Everything that came after was just. Management. Rome had a basic understanding of power. You don't just beat your enemy, you change the way people see them, and clothes are the quickest way to change how people see things. The clothes she wore during her punishment were never an accident for a captured queen. It was costume designed for an empire that made humiliation an art form. Queens who used to wear royal robes that were full of meaning and power had all of their royal clothes taken away. What they wore during a victory was carefully chosen to be strange enough to be seen as foreign, detailed enough to get attention, and strange enough to make fun of. Rome wanted the crowd to see difference first, then dignity, and then humanity much later. This wasn't about being comfortable. It was all about the difference. People in Rome were supposed to compare the look of the defeated queen to that of the victorious general, who was dressed in ceremonial purple and stood over her. One was a symbol of order and civilization. The other showed chaos that had been fixed. Rome liked a picture that didn't need to be explained. Jewelry was important too. Things that used to mean power became oddities. Necklaces turned into prizes, crowns turned into props. Sometimes queens were allowed to wear symbols of their former power, not out of respect, but because it was more satisfying to see authority stripped of power than to see it gone completely. Rome thought that humiliation worked best when it reminded people of what they had lost, and the crowd saw everything. Whispers spread quickly. There were comments made, then came the comparisons. She ruled them, someone would say, looking her up and down. That reaction was important to Rome. The empire let public opinion do some of the punishing for them. The fabric also had a deeper meaning. Rome's focus on the queen's foreignness made it even more clear that she had never really belonged in the world of power. People saw her rule as an odd exception rather than a real system. Rome didn't say she wasn't fit to be queen. It let her clothes say it. The effect on the queen herself was terrible. Your clothes are who you are. Being made to wear clothes that changed who you were in front of thousands of people was like having your past rewritten in real time. People no longer thought of her as a ruler who lost a war. People thought she was a show and that she shouldn't have been in charge at all. Rome didn't need to talk. The fabric spoke for itself. Rome added children to make a point that was very clear. They weren't there by accident or as collateral damage. They were part of the plan. When queens were caught, they were shown off in. Triumphs, they were sometimes made to stand next to their kids. Not only was this done out of cruelty, but also out of calculation. Rome knew that showing control over the future was the best way to show total victory. A queen who didn't have any children could still start a rebellion, a queen whose kids were chained up next to her. That was the end, with a bow on top. The message was very clear to the people watching in Rome. Rome had not only beaten the king, but it had made the bloodline neutral. No Avengers are waiting in the wings, no rightful heirs growing up where Rome can't get to them. The story ended here, in front of everyone on the street. Rome liked neat endings. Having kids around also made the queen look better in a very specific way, not by making people feel sorry for her, but by making people feel like it was going to happen. People no longer saw a woman who dragged her kids through humiliation as a strong leader. People saw her as a tragic figure whose resistance had failed not only her, but also those who relied on her. Rome liked that frame. It took the blame off the empire and put it squarely on the ruler who lost. And yes, it was on purpose. Roman audiences were not told to think how cruel. They were told that this is what happens when you fight back. This may have been the most painful punishment for the queen. Taking away someone's power is one thing. Another thing was seeing your kids become props in Rome's show. Rome didn't just take over land, it attacked family ties and turned them into warnings. Not all of the children were killed. Some became part of Roman families. Some of them faded into obscurity. Some were kept alive as a way to stop future uprisings. Rome liked to use leverage instead of violence whenever it could. But living didn't mean being free. The queen's legacy would not last in any recognizable way because the people she raised were Romanized, renamed, and taken away from their roots. Rome didn't just end reigns. It. Futures that have been redesigned. For Rome, this was efficient. It was scary for history because the empire knew something that most conquerors learn over time. You can't really beat a ruler by just breaking the throne. You take away the line that could ever get it back. Rome was not being kind when it let a captured queen live. It was planned out. Rome didn't mix kindness with survival, and we shouldn't either. Often, the best way to make a queen's punishment last longer was to keep her alive for an indefinite amount of time. A dead queen could make people want to fight back. A living one could stop it. Rome knew a lot about optics. A queen who was alive, breathing, and completely powerless sent a clearer message than an execution ever could. If the former ruler was still alive, her people couldn't rally around a martyr, especially if they saw her being paraded, imprisoned, or just heard her name spoken in whispers. When the symbol of resistance is still there, and obviously broken, hope fades faster. Rome kept some queens alive, though, on purpose. These women lived in controlled settings, such as guarded homes, temples, or prisons, where every move and interaction was watched. They were given just enough food, clothing, and medical care to stay alive. Think of it as a warning sign that has been carefully preserved instead of an honored captive. The cruelty was subtle, which made it work. No crowds, no cheering, just days and days without power, purpose, or choice. Rome knew that rulers who were used to giving orders didn't need chains to feel locked up. Silence was just as good. Rome thought this was a good way to run things. In talks, people could talk about a living queen. It might be helpful to casually mention her existence to stop uprisings. A lot of the time, You know, she's still alive was enough to quiet ambitious leaders who remembered how her resistance ended. And if she stopped being useful, Rome could change to fit her needs. Survival also gave Rome a chance to change her story. Over time, the queen became less of a ruler and more of a rumor. Writers from Rome redefined her as misguided, reckless, or doomed by her own ambition. The longer she was under Roman rule, the easier it was to get everyone to believe that her rule had always been shaky. From the queen's point of view, survival was a long process of breaking down. Every day took away another part of who I was. No court, no power, no voice, just being without making a difference. Rome didn't have to hurt her physically. It let time do its job, because an empire that was obsessed with control found the most satisfying. Death wasn't the punishment. It was seeing power fade away, one calm day at a time. It wasn't about iron bars and scary dungeons when Romans were in jail. That would have been way too obvious. Imprisonment was less obvious and much more effective for captured queens. They didn't just lock them up in Rome, it took away everything that had ever made them a threat. People didn't treat a queen who was in prison like a criminal. People acted like she was an annoyance that needed to be dealt with politely. She could live in a temple, a guarded villa, or a carefully watched home instead of a cell. Complex, or a carefully watched home instead of a cell. It could look comfortable from the outside, which was the point. Rome knew that people were less angry when they could see comfort. Rome could say it was better than everyone else because they kept a queen alive, fed, and housed while quietly taking away her power. There was no need for chains when no one cared what she said anymore. Being alone was the real prison. Queens were kept away from supporters, advisors, and anyone else who might remind them of who they had been. There was control over communication. People who came were screened. Letters disappeared in a strange way. Rome didn't completely ban contact. It just made sure that nothing important came out of the process. And then there was the routine, a never-ending, boring, carefully planned routine. There are no choices to make, no orders to give, and no audience. For someone who was taught to be in charge, routine was a way to break down their mind. Every day took away another layer of importance. Rome also knew how powerful uncertainty could be. People didn't often tell queens how long they would be held. Days turned into months, and months turned into years. The future was just a vague administrative possibility that men who lived far away and never meant to include her talked about. Sometimes, a Roman official would come to see her, not to make deals or threats, but just to remind her that Rome still remembered she was alive, and that only Rome could decide when she was no longer alive. This was not kind. It was the boss. Rome liked queens who were alive, but not active. There is a visible but silent presence, remembered but unable to do anything, a ruler who is alive. Without authority, it was clear that Rome's power went beyond the battlefield and into people's identities, and the message was quietly reinforced for people outside. Resistance does not cease with death. Sometimes it ends with years of waiting in a room where you can say anything and it doesn't matter. This was a classy punishment for Rome. No blood, no noise, just slow, steady, and perfectly organized control. Rome liked time more than speed or urgency. Rome knew that uncertainty could break a person down much more quickly than chains could. So, Rome didn't often announce plans for captured queens. It just sat there. People almost never told queens what would happen next. There was no plan for execution. There was no talk of release. There was no calendar, no countdown, and no feeling of moving forward. Days that all looked the same, with no noise. Rome thought that being clear was a privilege that defeated rulers had not earned. From the point of view of Rome, from this point of view, this was a great policy. A queen who didn't know what would happen to her couldn't make plans, couldn't hope properly, and couldn't get ready emotionally for anything in particular. When you have hope but no plan, you get anxious, and anxiety is tiring. Rome gave a lot of its punishment to the mind. Some queens had to wait months, while others had to wait years. Some people waited so long that their names were no longer talked about. Their rebellions were only footnotes, and only guards who changed shifts remembered them. Administrators who sent in reports. Rome was patient. That's what empires always do, and Rome was able to change things up. A living queen could be helpful today, but not tomorrow. If her old people got angry, people could casually bring up her survival as a way to reassure or scare her. If the political winds changed, she could be put to death at any time. Rome liked having choices. Certainty made choices limited. The uncertainty spread out as well. Other leaders heard things. She is still living. No. She is dead. No. She is in Rome. People got more confused. Then came fear. Rome didn't need to explain. Ambiguity worked perfectly. This was probably the hardest time for the queen. She was already out of power. Now she lost time itself. Days went by without any meaning. Years went by without any important events. Waiting turned into life. Rome didn't kill her. It took her future and wouldn't say why. Sometimes hope came back. A new emperor, a new governor, and a new policy. Maybe mercy would come. Rome let those thoughts live long enough to be. Quietly crushed by silence, Rome didn't hurry to punish because it didn't have to. The empire had learned something very important. You have power over the person when you control the timeline. And so the queen waited and waited and waited because Rome thought that the best punishment was not knowing when the story would end. People like their executions to be loud, dramatic, and full of show. But Rome was a useful empire. When it was time to kill a captured queen, there was usually a lot of drama. Not needed. The show had already taken place. The lesson had been given. What was left was administration. Most of the time, when a queen was caught, the execution was planned to be private. No speeches, no crowds, and no emotional closure. Rome had already used the queen as a symbol in victories, gossip, and years of being held captive. There was no need to say it again. Repetition could lead to sympathy, and Rome didn't like sympathy any more than rebellion. Execution was often done in prisons or under strict control when it happened. Homes. People often strangled each other. It was quick, quiet, and didn't leave any public remains that could inspire devotion. Rome liked ways that didn't make stories. A death without a story was a successful death, and timing was important. Executions didn't happen very often right after capture. They were put off until Rome had gotten every political advantage it could. The queen only lived as long as she was useful. The empire moved on with calm administration once she was no longer important. From Rome's point of view, this was self-control. The empire liked to think of itself as civilized, logical, and above violent emotions. If you killed a queen loudly, it would have shown that you were angry. Rome liked things to look like they were going to happen. The silence seemed to say that this is just how things end. There was no ceremony for the queen at the end. No last speech, no chance to get back her dignity, no dramatic resistance, just the quiet realization that the waiting was over and Rome no longer needed her. And for the rest of the world, it was important that there was no drama. There was no public execution to mark the moment, no clear end, just silence, rumors, and people forgetting over time. Rome knew that fear didn't always work as well as forgetting. Execution was not the last thing that happened in Rome. It was done with the paperwork. By the time the queen left, her story had been changed. Her power had been taken away, and her memory had become something easier to handle. The empire didn't need her to be alive or dead. It just needed her to be useless. And Rome closed the file when that condition was met. Rome liked to keep show and consequence separate. First, there was applause. Later came the quiet. The crowd had already gone home by the time the captured queen was killed. The decorations for the victory had been taken down, and Rome was already on to its next one. This timing was planned. It was a rule. Punishment in public was for learning. Death was the end. Rome knew that crowds could be unpredictable. Public executions could stir up anger, sympathy, or an annoying emotional attachment. If a queen was killed in front of an audience, she could become something that Rome hated very much. A martyr. Martyrs make stories happen. Stories make people want to fight back. Rome liked endings that made paperwork instead of stories, so the execution usually happened after the city had finished partying. When the cheering stopped, when the general went back to his normal life, and when the show was over, Rome acted quietly, efficiently, and without witnesses who might care. In front of the Roman people, the queen just disappeared. One day, people were talking about her during the victory. No one talked about her after that. Anger turned into silence. Curiosity turned into silence. Rome believed that silence could do what violence could not. This delay also gave Rome control over how far apart people felt. The queen was no longer a real person by the time she died. Not a living person anymore, walking the streets in chains. She turned into a rumor, a footnote, and a problem that had already been solved. Killing her at that point felt less like being mean and more like closing a book that everyone had already stopped reading. Rome also gained in terms of diplomacy. If you kill a queen right away, Your allies, family, or kingdoms that depend on you might get angry. Waiting helped to calm things down. Objections had lost their urgency by the time death happened. Rome was very good at letting anger die down on its own. This timing was one last cruel thing for the queen. The execution didn't happen at the height of attention, but rather after being alone and waiting. And erasure. There was no big ending, just the quiet thought that Rome was done with her. Rome didn't want people to remember its enemies when they were at their strongest. It wanted people to remember them when they were at their weakest, or not at all. So the queen didn't die as a ruler, a rebel, or even a symbol. She died after the applause, when no one was paying attention, which was exactly what Rome wanted. Killing a queen was not always the last thing Rome did. It wasn't always needed. It was sometimes not very useful. The most severe punishment was not death, but vanishing. Rome was good at making people disappear without leaving a body behind. Erasure was not obvious. It didn't need chains, guards, or people to see it. It needed people to write things down. Roman historians, poets, and officials were in charge of the story, and they used that power a lot. Queens who had once led armies and ruled over lands were now only briefly mentioned, had their stories changed, or were warned about barbarian women in vague ways. Their names were spelled wrong, made smaller, or left out completely. Rome did not say that these queens did not exist. It just made sure they didn't matter. This was not a mistake. Rome knew that memory is a powerful thing. If people remember a ruler well, they might also remember why they followed her. If they forget her, loyalty goes away on its own. Rome liked to forget. There was no need for troops. Some queens were so quietly absorbed into Roman life that history lost track of them completely. They were given new names, new jobs, married off, and turned into polite footnotes, living under the watchful eye of the Romans. Official documents stopped calling them queens. They turned into wives, daughters, or women from other countries. They were stripped of the titles that used to make them scary. Rome changed the personalities of queens even when they were remembered. Arrogance took over as leadership. Planning turned into carelessness. Resistance turned into madness. Roman writers didn't often say that these women were good rulers. That would have meant that Rome was up against real opposition. Instead, they were shown as emotional, impulsive, or doomed by their own desires. Rome's version of history didn't shout. It was like saying, this was never going to work anyway. It said something in a low voice. People started to believe those whispers as time went on. And the best part was that Rome made Eratia look real. People in the future thought these queens were not very important because Rome told the story that way. There are no monuments, no celebrations, and no names carved in stone. There is only absence. For the queen, this punishment went on. After death, her memory was no longer hers either. She didn't just lose her life, her freedom, or her throne. She lost her place in time. Rome didn't always have to kill its enemies. It sometimes just cut them out. And that was the ultimate victory for an empire that cared about staying the same. Rome did not let history happen by chance. It hired writers. Roman writers were some of the best executioners in the empire, whether they knew it or not. Once a queen who had been captured was defeated, humiliated, imprisoned, erased, or Roman writers took over to finish the job after they had been quietly killed. They didn't need guards or chains. They had parchment, which lasts longer than fear. These writers didn't often say that queens were strong leaders who posed a real threat. That would have meant that Rome was facing a lot of opposition, which was not okay. Instead, queens were turned into stories that warned people. Their bravery turned into foolishness. They turned their political skill into manipulation. Their refusal turned into hysteria. Rome did not fight with these women, it made fun of them. They did this with an air of intellectual superiority. Roman writers acted like calm, rational people who were talking about crazy people. It was clear what the implication was. Rome was the reason. It was crazy to resist. If a queen fought back, it wasn't because she wanted to win or had the support of the people. It was because she was unstable, emotional, or doomed by her own ambition. And these pictures spread because Rome was in charge of education. Future scholars learned how the Romans saw things. Later, historians copied sources from Rome. The queens became what Rome said they were, not because it was true, but because it was written first, and often the fact that it was so subtle is what made it so effective. Roman authors didn't yell insults, they let out a sigh. On the page, they shook their heads. They made the queen look like someone who could have won if she had just known her place. Instead of being cruel, they were condescending, which made the damage seem fair. Even compliments were bad for you. People might say the queen was brave, but only to show how sad it was that she would fail. Smart, but wrong, strong, but not real. There is no such thing as a compliment that ends in I have to. After hundreds of years, people forgot that the queen had fought against Rome. People remembered her as a mistake that showed how right Rome was. Rome understood something very important. Killing a leader stops resistance right now. Writing about them wrong stops resistance in the future. So, while soldiers captured queens and officials decided what would happen to them, it was the historians who made sure those queens never really got better. They lost more than just their kingdoms. They lost their good names, and that loss was permanent in the Roman Empire. Rome never punished queens who were captured for their own sake. That would have been a waste of time. Rome punished them for the good of the whole world. Every chain, every parade, and every carefully planned disappearance was meant to go outward, not inside. The queen was just a way to get things done. Reputation is what keeps empires going. The Romans knew this. Yes, its armies were strong, but its best weapon was hope. Kingdoms gave up not only because Rome might win, but also because everyone thought Rome would win. Captured queens helped keep that hope alive. When a foreign king or queen saw a Roman victory, they weren't supposed to be interested. They were supposed to feel like they were doing math. They were supposed to think that I was fighting back. This is the end. Not fast, Not cleanly, but slowly, in front of people and with paperwork. Rome knew that fear is most effective when it seems organized. Brutality that happens at random causes chaos. Punishment that is done on purpose makes people obey. It wasn't random cruelty that led to the deaths of captured queens. It was a policy that looked like it was going to happen. The message was aimed at other powerful leaders in particular. Rome wanted them to know that being important didn't keep them safe. Royal blood did not show mercy. Titles did not lead to better results. They really did punish. Worse. The longer it took Rome to tear you down, the higher you stood. And the word spread. Merchants told stories. Diplomats told each other secrets. Roman writers added just enough detail to the story to make it sound dumb to resist. Rome didn't have to threaten anyone directly. It let the example do the talking. There was also a quiet warning for Rome's own friends. Loyalty was rewarded, but independence was not. A queen who went against Roman rule, even for a short time, could become a warning story. It seemed like cooperation, safer when compared. Rome didn't often say, "Do what we say." Instead, it said, "Look what happened to her." The scariest part is how normal this became. Eventually, punishing captured queens didn't seem so strange anymore. It became normal. People didn't wonder what Rome would do when another ruler fell. They wanted to know how long it would take. Rome was successful because it made being in charge seem certain, and certainty seems permanent. When Rome punished queens they had captured, it wasn't just being mean, it was keeping up an image that went far beyond the empire's borders and lasted long after the queen's death. She hurt, but the lesson was never meant for her. In the end, Rome didn't punish queens they caught because they were weak. Rome punished them because they were still dangerous, even after losing. A queen was a symbol of something that Rome could never fully control. Power that did not come from Rome and did not need Roman approval. Empires can stand their enemies. They can put up with rebels. What they have trouble with are other options. A ruling queen represented the unsettling prospect that authority might exist beyond Rome's meticulously organized hierarchy. She had ruled without Roman gods, armies, laws, or paperwork. People were happy to follow her. That fact alone was enough to make it necessary to fix. Rome wasn't afraid, but it was very careful. It didn't like things that weren't clear, like loose ends or symbols that weren't clear. A captured queen was all three: going away, not treating, processing, or humiliating her enough could have led to the wrong conclusions. Rome liked its lessons to be clear, so it took queens apart piece by piece. First power, then respect, then time, and finally memory. Rome didn't hurry. It didn't have to. It had hundreds of years to repeat the same message over and over. If you resist, you won't just lose. You will be shown, put off, deleted, and rewritten. And here is the quiet irony: Rome's harsh treatment of captured queens shows how serious they were about it. Empires don't waste time making fun of weak enemies. They put that effort into people who might otherwise be remembered as real options. The punishment of queens was very careful because they were important. Historians of Rome were afraid of this too. The need to put these women down, twist the truth, and make them seem less important long after they died shows fear, not confidence. Rome wanted people in the future to think that these queens were going to fail, not succeed. Leaders who almost made it. But we still talk about them, even though Rome tried hard. Their stories lived on, broken, twisted, and incomplete, but still alive. Each remembered queen is a crack in Rome's story of how things had to happen. Evidence that there was once resistance that was strong enough to scare the most powerful empire of its time. The Romans won the wars. Rome was in charge of the records. But Rome never completely controlled memory, and maybe that's the last failure, because an empire that fears how its enemies might be remembered shows something very human beneath all that law and marble. Rome was even afraid of being challenged. London in the Middle Ages didn't cause crime, but it did make it easy to commit. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the city was bursting at the seams, with maybe 80,000 people crammed inside old Roman walls that were never meant to hold that many people, carts, animals, and dreams. The streets were narrow, crooked, and often didn't have names. Each house leaned out, making it look like. A new floor was put in, which blocked sunlight and kept smells in. You picked the wrong century if you wanted order, light, or your own space. Most people in London lived and worked in the same small building. A butcher lived above his store. An alewife brewed beer, served it, and raised her kids in the same smoky room. When night fell, shutters closed, candles flickered, and whole neighborhoods went dark. There were no streetlights, and the moonlight was a rare treat. There were a lot of shadows, and they were great. Accomplices. Crime grew because there were always chances to do it. Customers were less focused when the markets were busy. Every day, pilgrims and foreign merchants came with bags full of coins and no idea where they were going. After curfew, the tavern let drunk men out into the streets. 10 apprentices slept in each room. Servants carried things through alleys that were only big enough for 2 people to walk through. You didn't need to be good at anything to steal. You had to be patient. The way London was set up didn't help police. The city was split into wards, each of which was in charge of its own police. Most of the policing was done by local men who worked for free and stayed awake while on night watch with staves and lanterns. They weren't professionals, they were neighbors, and they knew who lived where, which made it hard to enforce the law. It was easy to arrest someone you didn't know. It was a whole different story to arrest your cousin. Next came the river. The Thames was London's road, trash dump, and way out all at the same time. Things that were stolen disappeared on boats. Bodies sometimes did as well. Docks attracted an equal number of sailors, workers, prostitutes, thieves, and gamblers. Crime followed the flow of money. London was also a draw. The city promised work, privacy, and chaos to people who were poor, desperate, or running from something. For a lot of people, it only brought hunger and temptation. Stealing was not always a job option. A lot of the time, it was a short-term survival plan that backfired. In short, Medieval London was dirty, noisy, crowded, poorly lit, and not very safe. Watched over. The city wasn't made to stop crime. It was a city that quietly let it in, closed the door, and acted like it didn't see it until someone screamed. The sound of fingers moving where they shouldn't have been was the background noise of medieval London. The most common crime in the city was pickpocketing, which was also the hardest to stop. There were people everywhere. There were a lot of people in markets, churchyards, parades, executions, and festivals, where bodies were close together, hands moved around. The A wealthy noble was not a common target. The average person carried all of their money on their belt. People wore purses with cords on them to keep coins in them for ease and necessity. There were no banks for people to get their daily pay. You carried your money if you made it, and if you carried it, someone would see it. Cut purses were good at getting rid of those purses with small knives that cut cords cleanly and quietly. The victim didn't feel anything until the weight was gone. Some thieves worked alone, but a lot of them worked in groups. One person hit the target, another yelled or spilled beer, a third one made it. The purse had already changed hands twice by the time the confusion cleared up. A lot of the time, kids were involved. Orphans and runaways quickly learned that small hands raised less suspicion. They learned to look for merchants who were distracted, sailors who were drunk, or pilgrims who were looking at relics instead of their things. If caught, kids could be beaten or branded, but a lot of judges were afraid to hang them. This made them helpful tools in a harsh system. Markets were great places to hunt. Buyers were focused on bargaining. Sellers were only interested in making money. Thieves were interested in both. Church crowds were just as tempting. Being religious didn't keep your money safe, and sermons about sin didn't stop someone from stealing when they hadn't eaten in days. The punishment for stealing depended on how much the thing was worth. If you steal a little bit, you might have to pay a fine, spend time in jail, or get whipped. Branding on the cheek or forehead for larger amounts of money marked the thief for life. People who did it again were punished by mutilation. Most of the time, they lose an ear or hand. Hanging waited at the end of the path, where everyone could see it and remember it well. The system included public shame. People who stole things were made to walk through the streets, where they were laughed at, spat on, and sometimes hit with bad food. The goal was to scare people into not doing something by making them feel bad about themselves, but it often made criminals even worse. Still, pickpocketing never went away. It changed. Thieves got better at what they do. People in London learned to hold on to their bags more tightly. The city accepted it as part of everyday life, like mud on your boots or smoke in the air. People in medieval London weren't surprised when they lost money. It was to be expected. People in medieval London went to taverns to relax, which is why trouble always seemed to happen there. Ale was cheap, safer than water, and people drank a lot of it. By the time the sun went down, a lot of bars were already loud. They were dangerous by night. Drink made people talk more, made them less loyal, and turned small insults into matters of honor that needed fists. Most fights in taverns started over things that weren't worth it. Remembering a spilled cup, a dice throw that was in question, and an insult that was thought to be directed at a woman who may or may not have been there. When voices rose, others quickly joined in, either out of loyalty, boredom, or just the fun of chaos. People used benches as weapons. Tankers flew. People later said that knives came out faster than anyone thought. Weapons were common. Men carried daggers as weapons and tools. It was against the law for apprentices to carry swords, but they did anyway. From the docks, sailors brought knives. A broken bottle or a fire could even. Poker could kill you. A fight that started with yelling could end with a body on the floor and no one knowing who hit the last blow. Violence in the streets often came next. When the bars closed at curfew, drunk customers spilled into alleys that were already dark and narrow. Fights kept happening outside, and sometimes watchmen got involved. They were just as likely to be hurt as they were to help. Night watch patrols were not paid well and did not get good training. Many people would rather shout warnings from a distance than get involved directly. The law took violence seriously, but not evenly. If no one died, punishments ranged from fines to time in the pillory. If you get hurt badly, you could go to jail. Homicide made things more difficult. It was theoretically okay to kill someone in self-defense, but it was hard to prove. Witnesses were often drunk, biased, or not there when they were needed. Rivalries between guilds also led to violence. Apprentices from different trades fought a lot, especially during holidays. Butchers and bakers fought. Fishmongers fought with almost everyone. These fights weren't just random. They were ways for people to show who they were, show loyalty, and settle old scores with a lot of excitement and not much planning. Authorities tried to crack down by setting curfews and banning weapons in bars, but they didn't always follow through. Rowdy customers were important to tavern owners. Watchmen had to stay safe from being stabbed. People put up with violence in taverns because they were used to it. London was okay with bruises, broken bones, and even a few dead bodies, as long as they didn't go too far. As the cost of a city where people drank together every night. While officially against prostitution, medieval London relied on it in secret. People thought brothels were a necessary evil because they kept men from committing worse sins by putting their sexual desires in controlled spaces. The city did not say they were illegal. Instead, it tried to control them, which meant that authorities had to accept that sex work was a part of city life, as long as it stayed in plain sight. Most legal brothels were in certain areas, with Suffolk being one of the most common. Throughout the Thames, this area was in a different jurisdiction, which made it easy for London's civic authorities to not have to deal with it directly. The brothel paid fees, followed the rules, and let people check on it. Prostitutes had to wear clothes that made them stand out from honest women, which was very important in court and on the street. Even though there were rules, brothel raids happened a lot. Officials sometimes held moral crackdowns, usually when there was political unrest or religious pressure. These raids were more about showing power than stopping prostitution. Women were arrested, fined, shamed in public, or put in jail for a short time, and then let go back into the same system that had just punished them. Clients were not often the target. Most of the time, men who were caught during raids were either warned or ignored, unless they were married, clergy, or politically inconvenient. Women, especially those without strong protectors, had to bear much of the moral weight. An illegal brothel also did well. Some ran out of bathhouses, taverns, or private homes. Some were just rooms that people rented for the night. These areas didn't have any safety features, so they were more likely to be attacked, stolen from, or taken advantage of. People who worked as prostitutes in illegal places could be beaten, robbed, or arrested with little chance of getting help. Sex related crimes went beyond just prostitution. Adultery, fornication, and sodomy were all crimes, but how strictly they were punished depended a lot on who saw them and what people thought of them. Even accusations could ruin lives. Without any proof, a woman's word was worth less than a man's, and a poor woman's word didn't matter at all. Fines, public penance, and jail time were all possible punishments. If someone did something really bad, or did it more than once, they could be kicked out of the city. Again, public shame was the weapon of choice. People who did wrong were put on display, named, and called moral failures. Their reputations are ruined for good. Raids on brothels made it look like moral order was being restored, but they didn't change much. The city needed sailors and sex workers, needed something to do, and officials needed money. London in the Middle Ages did not want to get rid of crime. It just wanted to handle it quietly, without admitting how much it really needed it. In medieval London, stealing was more than just a crime. It was a show for everyone to see. The city really believed in punishment that could be seen. People were supposed to see, remember, and be afraid of justice. If someone stole, the goal was not to help them change. It was a warning, stealing small things like people often stole bread, tools, or clothes, especially when it was cold or there wasn't enough food. Courts understood when people were desperate, but they didn't often let them off the hook. A first-time offender might have to pay a fine or get whipped. The punishment became physical if they couldn't pay, which most of them couldn't. Pain took the place of money as a form of payment. People were especially afraid of branding. A thief would always be marked by a hot iron pressed into their cheek, forehead, or hand. The mark told everyone, including employers, neighbors, and strangers, what they had done. Once someone was branded, it was almost impossible to find honest work, which quietly encouraged them to do it again. The system made the criminals it said it would stop. More serious thefts led to cutting off body parts. They cut off ears. Hands were cut off. These punishments were legal, part of a ritual, and done in public. People in the crowd were there to learn as well as have fun. Parents brought their kids so they could learn about consequences early on. Execution was at the very bottom of the scale. Hanging was the most common way, done at places like Tyburn. A person could be hanged for stealing more than a certain amount or for doing it more than once. The limit for a capital theft was low. A coat, a purse, or some coins might be enough. Fear influenced everyday actions. People in London locked their chests, hid their valuables, and traveled in groups. Shutters and bars were put up in stores. People remembered faces, especially those of criminals they knew. Rumors spread quickly, and they often made things seem more dangerous than they really were, turning strangers into threats. But punishment in public also made people feel sorry for them. Sometimes people in the crowd prayed for the people who were going to die. Sometimes they stepped in and cut down a body that was hanging in the hopes of saving it. Execution was scary, but it was also a group event that mixed justice, religion, and uneasy compassion. Officials thought that harsh punishment kept things in order. In reality, it made the city very tense with worry. Stealing didn't stop. It changed. Criminals got quicker, quieter, and more picky. People learned to live on edge, be suspicious, and be ready to lose. Everything in a single, careless moment. Crime didn't make people afraid in medieval London. It was a part of the system, carefully cultivated, shown in public, and deeply felt by everyone who walked the streets with something worth stealing. When the sun went down in medieval London, the city didn't sleep. It gave up. Darkness turned streets that were once familiar into unknown places. Without streetlights, only candles and fires in the fireplace gave off light, and most homes went dark. Them early to save money. As a result, the city was full of shadows and crime. At night, thieves got braver. Burglars broke into homes and stores by forcing doors, prying open shutters, or slipping through windows that weren't locked. Churches weren't safe either. Sacred places had important vessels, candles, and gifts, and thieves didn't worry about getting punished by God when they were hungry or greedy. It was against the law to commit sacrilege, but it was also a good business. The city depended on the night watch to keep things in order. These guards were local men who had to serve because they had to, not because they wanted to. They weren't paid well or at all, didn't have the right tools, and were often old or new to the job. They patrolled the wards in small groups, calling out the hours and looking for anything strange while carrying staves and lanterns. In theory, but in practice, many people slept, drank, or stayed out of trouble. It was dangerous to fight armed thieves in narrow alleys, and there wasn't much reason to be brave. The injured guard did not get any money. People prayed for a dead one. Criminals knew this and saw the watch as an annoyance instead of a threat. Curfews weren't always followed. Bells told people when it was time to stop moving, but bars, brothels, and private parties often ignored them. People who were caught outside after curfew could be questioned or held, but it depended on who you were. Merchants who were respectable got through more easily than servants or foreigners. Night also hid violence. It was harder to look into assaults, robberies, and murders when it was dark. Witnesses went missing. The proof disappeared. Many cases were never solved and were only known as rumors or deaths that couldn't be explained. The river was able to keep secrets well enough. The city tried to make things better by hiring more watchmen, setting stricter curfews, and getting better equipment. None of them fixed the main issue. London was too big, too dark, and too busy for good nighttime control. For most people, night was dangerous. Families were inside with the doors locked and the windows closed. People tried not to travel after dark unless they had to. People who went through the People who went to the city at night did so for a reason, out of fear or both. During the Middle Ages in London, the day was for business and the law. Night was a time of chance, desperation, and the quiet knowledge that once it got dark, help was not guaranteed, and justice could wait until morning. Prisons in London during the Middle Ages were not places where people were punished in the way we think of them today. They were pens for holding bodies until a decision was made. Justice moved slowly, and while it did, prisoners waited in conditions that were a lot worse than the sentence itself. Newgate was the most famous prison. People were afraid of it just because of its name. Prisoners had to pay for everything, including food, bedding, chains, and even taking off chains. People who had money lived a little better. People who didn't have it were hurt. They were always hungry, dirty, and sick. Rats could move around freely. Lice did too. People who owed money, stole things, were suspected of murder, or were political prisoners were all in the same place. There wasn't much difference between people by crime, age, or gender. Violence in prisons was. Guards often turned a blind eye unless they were paid off. To stay alive, you needed connections, strength, or luck. Justice depended a lot on accusations and witness statements. The investigations were short. A lot of the evidence was circumstantial. Juries were made up of local men who might have known the victim or the accused. Reputation was very important. It was easier to condemn a known troublemaker than a respected guild member, no matter what the facts were. Once they started, trials could go by quickly, but it took a long time to get to that point. Time. Prisoners waited weeks or even months, not knowing if they would be fined, hurt, sent away, or killed. Being anxious was part of the punishment. In England, torture was not as common as it was in other places, so confessions were sometimes encouraged through pressure instead of force. Not all justice was harsh. Sometimes courts showed mercy, especially to people who had never been in trouble before or who had support from their community. Pardons were possible, and they were often given out during religious holidays or royal events. There was both kindness and cruelty, but in an unpredictable way. People didn't have a lot of faith in the justice system. Some people thought courts were important protectors. Some people thought they were tools for the rich and powerful. It was well known that there was corruption. Bribes could make sentences less harsh. Influence could make charges go away. The poor knew that the law wasn't blind. It looked very closely at your status. Prisons were a perfect example of this imbalance. They punished people for being poor as much as for being criminals. For many, just being in prison ruined their job, family, and future, no matter what happened. In the Middle Ages, in London, justice wasn't just about being guilty or innocent. It was about being able to last. If you made it through the waiting, the dirt, and the fear, the next sentence might feel like an end instead of a beginning. In medieval London, the day of the execution was not quiet, serious, or private. It was noisy, full of people, and too festive for comfort. When people heard that someone was going to hang, they came out in large numbers. Food was sold by vendors. Kids climbed up to get a better look. What was meant to scare people often turned into fun. Most people were put to death at well-known places like Tyburn, which is just outside the city. People who were sentenced to death were marched through the streets, sometimes tied to a cart or hurdle so that people could gather. This parade was important. It turned punishment into a moral lesson that was on display. A final warning given in steps. Hanging was the most common way to kill someone, especially thieves. It was easy, cheap, and open to everyone. Death didn't always happen quickly. Short drops meant slow strangulation. Everyone in the crowd saw everything. Some people prayed, while others did. Some people yelled encouragement, hoping that the person being punished would repent loudly enough to save their soul, if not their body. Executions helped keep society in order. Instead of being sad, criminals were shown as examples of what not to do, but sympathy often crept in. A lot of the people who were condemned were young, poor, or obviously scared. Moms passed out. Friends cried. Sometimes the crowd stepped in and pulled on legs to speed up death, which was a cruel act of mercy. In some well-known cases, bodies were left hanging for hours or even days. The point of this was to make the lesson last longer. The line between law and chaos was marked by rotting bodies. People in London learned where not to step, both physically and morally. Not all executions were the same. Instead of being hanged, nobles who were found guilty of serious crimes might be beheaded. A death that is cleaner and faster. Status followed you to the scaffold. Hierarchy still mattered, even in death. Rituals made the moment less tense. Priests said prayers. Confessions were encouraged. A well-spoken final speech could earn respect or forgiveness. A defiant one could earn hatred. People remembered, repeated, and sometimes wrote down last words, which made them important. Execution days showed that medieval justice didn't always make sense. The city wanted fear, order, and obedience, but it also craved drama. Punishment was law, theater, and morality play combined. For Londoners, the gallows were not abstract threats. They were familiar landmarks. Everyone knew someone who had stood there waiting. Crime ended lives publicly, loudly, and in full view, ensuring no one forgot what the city demanded in return for order. Crime in medieval London was not an interruption to daily life. It was sewn into it. People didn't think of safety in the way we do now. They knew there would be danger, loss, and the need to always be on guard. To survive, you had to change instead of fight. People in London learned habits at a young age. People tied their purses tightly and wore them under their clothes when they could. Doors were barred at dusk. Neighbors listened for unfamiliar footsteps. Strangers were watched carefully, especially at markets. and taverns. Trust existed, but it was cautious and conditional. Communities policed the Sillamoves as much as the law did. Reputation mattered. A known thief found doors closed and work scarce. Gossip spread faster than official warnings. At the same time, communities protected their own. Witnesses sometimes lied. Juries hesitated to condemn neighbors they knew, even when guilt was obvious. Justice bent under familiarity. Fear shaped social behavior. Women avoided certain streets alone. Merchants traveled in groups. Apprentices learned which taverns were the safest and which ones to leave before dark. Parents didn't tell their kids not to do things with vague morals. They showed them real-life examples. People knew the names of the people who had been killed. People knew where it took place. Religion saw Christ as a sin, but hunger often saw it as a need. A lot of criminals didn't think of themselves as bad people. They were workers who had no jobs, servants who were fired without pay, and immigrants who had no friends. London promised them things and then punished them for believing them. The police understood this tension, but didn't often talk about what caused it. It was easier to punish harshly than to change. It was cheaper to kill people in public than to give them welfare. The city chose fear over answers and show over stability. London survived, though. Trade went on. The taverns were always full. The day after the executions, the markets opened again. The city wasn't destroyed by crime, it formed it. The constant struggle between danger and order made the people strong, wary, and very practical. People in London in the Middle Ages knew the rules could keep them safe one day and kill them the next. The law was clear, violence was common, and staying alive depended more on being aware than on being innocent. In the end, crime in London during the Middle Ages was not unusual. It happened because of a lot of people living in a small area, being poor, having opportunities, and people being people, all happening in narrow streets with leaning houses while neighbors watched, knowing how fragile safety really was. Versing was born into power long before he ever thought about rebelling. The Arvery were not a small GIC tribe. They were a big one, hidden away in the woods and hills. They were one of the most powerful groups in Central Gaul, rich, respected in the military, and very proud of their family tree. Being born into Arverian nobility meant that you were always surrounded by people who expected you to become someone great and who reminded you of who you were supposed to be. His family was near the top of this list. Keeltillis, his father, was not a normal chief. He was powerful enough to want to be king, which was a risky goal in a world that didn't trust centralized power. The very shared leadership talked about it and fought over it all the time. If a man reached too high, his own people might call him a tyrant. From a young age, Vercingetorix would have been surrounded by a warrior aristocracy. Not papers or titles, but bravery, kindness, and loyalty showed status. Young boys from noble families were taught to fight, ride, hunt, and put up with pain without complaining. People liked strength, but they also liked self-control. A future leader needed to be disciplined as much as anger. He grew up hearing people talk about his ancestors with respect. During feasts, where meat was carved and honor was given out with food, their deeds were read aloud. These get togethers weren't just parties, they were lessons. Every story made the point that being noble meant having responsibilities. You stood up for your people, you kept the tradition alive, you remembered insults. Politics were very important in the Arvari world. Alliances changed, clans that were enemies kept a close eye on each other. Even in families of nobility, under stress, loyalty could break. Versaterix would have learned early on that power is weak, and that people can go from liking you to being suspicious of you in a matter of hours. And then there was the city of Rome, not yet an occupying force in his childhood, but stories, trade, and rumors were making them more common. Rome was far away, but it was coming, said to be rich, well organized, and dangerous. Rome was both interesting and scary for a young noble. When Vercettix was born, he was in a system that valued strength, memory, and freedom above all else. He was taught not to follow orders quietly, but to lead loudly. That identity, which he made before he ever fought with a sword, would affect every decision he made. There was a time when loyalty, survival, and revenge all came together. In the world where Vercingetorix grew up, memory was more important than ink. Writing existed among the Avery, but it wasn't trusted with the people's souls. Voices, not pages, carried laws, history, and identity. If you forgot, you lost who you were. It was a holy duty to remember. As a child, versing would. He listened more than he read. Elders told stories about their ancestors that went back generations, naming warriors, chiefs, and rivals who had long since died but were still alive in the stories. These were not just stories from the past. They were reminders that the living were only temporary caretakers of a much older legacy. Every name had hopes and dreams. Bards had a lot of power. They were historians, moral judges, and people who made people laugh all at the same time. They sang about victories and betrayals at feasts, praising generosity and making fun of cowardice. Their words could make a man look good or bad without anyone knowing. Young nobles listened closely. A future leader needed to know how stories affected power. Ritual feasts were like classrooms. The meat was cut into pieces based on rank, and each piece had a meaning. It wasn't by chance that the best cut went to someone. Kids learned about hierarchy without being told to. You watched, remembered, and learned the rules. People noticed the mistakes. Silence was more educational than correction. Druids also had an impact on education, though, indirectly. They were in charge of religious law and the order of the universe, and people respected and feared them. Instead of formal lessons, noble children learned from rituals, taboos, and examples. The notion that the world was regulated by invisible equilibria emerged early on. It was just as important to train the mind as it was to train the body. Boys had to learn long speeches, poems, and legal cases by heart. This made memory and discipline sharper. A leader who couldn't remember promises, insults, or alliances was not fit to rule. Rome, on the other hand, wrote everything down. laws, contracts, and orders. The elites in the GIC knew this and often looked at it with suspicion. Writing fixed power in ways that tradition didn't like. For Versetics, oral culture strengthened personal honor, loyalty, and flexibility over abstract authority. Vercingetorix was already being shaped by a culture that thought words could bind warriors, and that memory itself was a weapon by the time he was a teenager. He learned how to fight battles long before he would have to face Roman legions. Story, identity, and significance. Those lessons would be just as useful as any sword. Childhood didn't last long for the Arvari. They were already measuring Vercingetorix for the life of a warrior by the time he could run. You had to have strength, endurance, and bravery. They were worth a lot to people. A noble boy who couldn't fight wasn't just weak, he was a problem. Training for the body started early and never stopped. In the forests and hills of central Gaul, boys fought, raced, and hunted. These things weren't games. They taught how to work together, how to handle pain, and how to stay balanced. It was expected that people would get hurt. People were told not to complain. Long before they became adults, people respected endurance. Weapons were added one at a time. First shields and spears, then swords. Young nobles practiced formation fighting to learn how to hold their ground, protect their friends, and move forward under pressure. Bravery was important, but loyalty was even more so. A warrior who broke ranks put everyone in danger. Hunting was also a way to get ready for war. Tracking prey made people more patient. The kill tested will. Feasts that came after helped people be more generous. A good hunter was expected to share, not keep. Giving, not keeping, made a person's reputation grow. First would have kept a close eye on the older warriors. Veterans wore their scars with pride, showing that they had survived and earned their respect. People kept telling stories about past battles, focusing on both brave and treacherous moments. These stories were both warnings and sources of inspiration. Discipline was social, not institutional. Shame made people act better than punishment. People remembered cowardice. People praised bravery. A man's public reputation followed him everywhere. This put a lot of pressure on a young noble to do well all the time. There were also ritual parts to the training. People made offerings before battles or hunts. People swore oaths. Warriors thought they were connected to each other and to gods and ancestors who were watching them closely. It wasn't just personal failure, it was spiritual. Rome came up again at the edges of these lessons. People said that Roman soldiers were strict, unyielding, and terrifyingly well organized. GIC warriors liked how strong they were, but didn't like how stiff they were. Being GIC meant putting a high value on bravery and freedom, even if it meant paying a price. By the time they were teenagers, Versetics had internalized a warrior identity that was shaped by physical hardship, public expectation, and sacred duty. He was being taught not just how to fight, but also how to get people to follow him. That training would soon run into betrayal, loss, and a lesson that would shape his future much more than any victory in the field. The most important lesson of Vercingetorix's youth did not come from training or rituals. It came from seeing power turn in on itself and eat itself. It wasn't foreign enemies who killed his father, Keotilus. It was other Gauls. That one thing changed everything that came after it. Celtillus was a powerful Arvian noble who tried to do something that not many people would have dared to do: bring back kingship among his people. The Arvari used to rule over a lot of land, but memories of their rule made people suspicious. GIC elites were afraid of any man who gained too much power because they thought that kingship led to tyranny and civil war. It's not clear if Keotus really wanted total power or just more unity. What mattered was how people saw things. Other nobles said he was too ambitious, betrayed them, and dangerously consolidated his power. This was unacceptable in a society that valued shared leadership. The punishment was harsh and public. His own people killed Celtus on purpose to send a message to others not to do the same. Goals. It was fair for the community. It was terrible for his family. Vercetix was still young, but old enough to know what had happened. It became dangerous to say his father's name. Allies pulled away from each other. The family's position fell apart overnight. Being noble didn't mean you were safe. Loyalty was not always there. Vercingetorix learned a lesson that was stronger than any battle drill in this moment. Power without unity leads to destruction. His father had not given in to Rome. He had fallen because of fear, jealousy, and broken leadership. The execution also left behind a quiet, lasting bitterness. The same society that taught loyalty had turned on one of its own. Honor was weak. Justice turned out to be political. From this point on, Versing lived with a lot of contradictions. He was meant to be a leader, but leadership had killed his father. He was taught to trust his people, but they had killed their own leader. Rome, which was far away but getting stronger, looked different now. Where GIC unity had failed, the Roman order lasted. This difference planted dangerous thoughts. Maybe the real enemy wasn't foreign control, but division within the country. Vercetix didn't become a rebel right away after Celtus died, but it did take away his innocence. It taught him that being brave wasn't enough to stay alive. It took control of loyalty, stories, and fear. He would remember that lesson long after he was a child. It would shape how he later brought tribes together, punished dissent, and accepted that rebellion, like leadership, required sacrifice. Vercingetorix did not get his father's power after Celtillus was killed. He got his danger from his family. People used to respect the name, but now they were suspicious of it. In a society where memory was important, just being associated with someone could ruin your future. For a while, staying quiet was the best thing he could do. Sources aren't sure about formal exile, but it's clear that Vercingetorix was pushed to the edges of power. People at councils no longer wanted him there. His family's voice got quieter. To stay alive, you had to hold back. A young noble who spoke too boldly might have ended up like his father. This time was quiet but important. Without a public role, Versing learned how to watch. He saw how leaders fought, how alliances changed, and how fear made decisions more than honor. He found out who gained from his father's death and who was sad about it. He became tougher because he was alone. He had to be patient, even though warrior culture valued action. This made things very balanced. He kept training for violence, but he learned when not to use it. A lot of warriors never learned the difference. He also learned more about Gaul as a whole. When you left the Averi heartland, you met other tribes, learned about their customs, and fought with them. Each group had its own way of leading and what was most important to them. People talked about unity a lot, but it was hard to achieve. These years made Rome look clearer. Roman traders, diplomats, and soldiers were no longer just rumors. They were there, well organized, and sure of themselves. Their ties to some powerful GIC people caused problems. A few chiefs thought Roman stability was great. Some people didn't like the Romans getting involved, but they did take Roman gold. Vercingetorix saw how Rome took advantage of division. It selectively rewarded cooperation and punished resistance. This plan made Gaul weaker without starting a war. The lesson was clear. Silence also helped grief turn into determination. It was no longer shocking that his father was killed. It became a point of reference, a reminder of what bad leadership costs and what politics based on fear does. When this time is over, Vercingetorix was no longer just a noble who had lost everything. He was very careful about watching power, loyalty, and weakness. He had learned that being brave wasn't enough to stay alive. It needed to be timed right. This chapter of restraint would make what he did next seem sudden and violent. In reality, rebellion had been quietly building up over the years as Gaul slowly fell apart, and Rome waited for the pieces to fall into place. As Vercingetor got older, Rome stopped being a vague threat and turned into a living system that he could study. He saw Roman power grow not through constant violence, but through discipline, building things, and giving to some people. This made him both interested and uneasy. Roman soldiers did things differently than GIC warriors. They practiced all the time. They did what they were told without question. Their loyalty was to the institution, not to each other. Roman commanders used structure, while GIC leaders used reputation and persuasion. Vercingetorix saw the strength in this, even though he hated how rigid it was. He probably met Roman soldiers and allied GYC leaders who had taken on Roman ways. Latin words made their way into GY speech. Roman goods were widely available. Roads went through tribal land. There were no forts before, but now there are. These weren't invasions in the sense of a big deal. They were quiet claims of permanence. Some GIC nobles were happy about this. The Roman alliance brought stability, trade, and respect. Some people didn't like it, but they weren't united enough to fight back. Vercingetorix understood that Rome didn't have to take over Gaul right away. It could wait while Gaul fell apart from the inside. It's important to note that Vercingetorix did not fight for Rome during this time, unlike some GIC leaders who did. This made him free. He learned by watching instead of doing. He looked at Roman tactics from the outside and saw what they were good at and what they could do better. He saw how hard it was for Roman armies to fight when their supply lines were cut and the land was against them. He saw how much they needed discipline and order, which could be bad traits in places that are out of control. He would later use these observations to come up with his plan of scorched earth and attrition. He also knew that following the GIC tradition alone wasn't enough. Fear, personal ambition, and tribal rivalries had already broken up the group once. His father's death was still a warning. Vercetix started to think about a synthesis. GIC bravery mixed with Roman-style coordination that doesn't mean Roman control. This was a very new idea in a culture that valued freedom more than structure. This time made him better at thinking strategically. He was no longer just a soldier who knew how to fight. He was becoming a leader who knew how things worked. Rome wasn't unbeatable, but you couldn't just attack it. Vercingetorix got ready for a future fight by learning about Rome without serving it. This fight would require patience, unity, and a willingness to give up tradition in order to keep independence. By the time Vercetix was a full-grown adult, he knew that rebellion wouldn't start with swords. People would be the first thing. There was no nation called Gaul. It was a patchwork of tribes, each of which was very independent and didn't trust the others. If he tried to bring people together, he might end up like his father. Vercetix moved slowly. He talked to people who had lost because of the Romans first, not people who had gained from them. Warriors who had lost their land, younger nobles who didn't have any power, and communities that had to deal with Roman demands were more open. These were people who had complaints but couldn't speak up. He framed resistance not as ambition but as survival. Rome didn't need kings. It needed people to work with it. Tribal elites who joined forces with Rome got short-term safety but lost their freedom. Vercingetorix made this point quietly, letting others come to their own conclusions. People thought he was Celtus's son, which helped and hurt him. Some people were afraid of his family background. Others thought it showed that he knew what it would cost to be divided. He didn't promise fame. He promised discipline, shared sacrifice, and punishment for betrayal. He demanded obedience from his followers, unlike other GIC leaders. Orders were not hints. Dissent had boundaries. This made some nobles uneasy, but it pleased warriors who were sick of not being able to make up their minds. Vercingetorix knew that Rome would take advantage of any weakness. Ritual had a part to play. People swore oaths in public. Feasts brought people closer together. Religion was used not only to make things right, but also to hold people accountable. Breaking unity was not only a political betrayal, but also a spiritual failure. At the same time, there were more Romans. Caesar's campaigns elsewhere in Gaul sent shockwaves. Tribes watched cities fall, leaders executed, and resistance crushed. Fear spread faster than hope. Versing leveraged this fear. He argued that delay guaranteed subjugation. Unity gave us a chance. His message was not good. It was important. This stage was weak. A single betrayal could ruin everything. One accusation of ambition could bring back memories of his father's death. versing balanced power and self-control, constantly knowing that leadership itself was still in doubt. What he got during this time was not an army, but momentum and loyalty based on shared risk instead of shared victory. Not victory, but consent under pressure laid the groundwork. Rebellion was no longer just a thought, it was starting to seem possible. As unity slowly grew, Vercingetorix had to make a choice that would define him long before the war started. Resistance against Rome couldn't look like the GIC uprisings of the past, facing Roman legions head on in. Conventional warfare had failed too many times. It took more than just bravery. Something stronger was needed. Vercingetorix preferred denial to confrontation. If supply, order, and stability were good for Rome, then Gaul would be unstable on purpose. Not only would Roman armies not get food, but Gauls would also not get food. Crops would be destroyed, and villages would be burned. It was a plan that required Gaul to be obedient and make sacrifices on a level they had never tried before. This choice was very unpopular. Land, harvest, and other things were important to GIC identity, and kindness. It felt like betrayal to burn one's own fields. A lot of chiefs were unsure. Some people openly opposed the idea. Vercingetorix did not change. Rome could start over. Gaul could not live through being occupied. To enforce this policy, the government had to be almost tyrannical. Communities that said no were punished. They took the animals. People threatened leaders. Unity now had teeth. For the first time, resistance needed more than just excitement. It required following the plan. This was the lesson his father taught him. Celtullus had gone too far without getting people to follow. Versing wouldn't make that mistake again. Unity would be required, not asked for. This choice had a lot of moral weight. Families saw their homes burn down in front of their eyes. Then came hunger. Anger bubbled up. But the other option was Roman seizure, taxes, and long-term control. Vercingetorix saw destruction as short-term pain for long-term survival. Rome didn't think this would happen. Roman generals thought that rebellion would fall apart under stress. Instead, they found land that had been burned and roads that were empty. Supply lines were thin and discipline was weak. This was the real start of Vercingetorix's rebellion. Before any battles were fought, he had turned resistance from defiance into policy. Gaul stopped responding. It was changing the battlefield. The cost was very high, but the choice was made on purpose. Versing knew that being a leader meant being hated as much as being followed. To stay alive, people had to be cruel to themselves. He chose fire over giving up, which went too far for most GIC leaders to follow. From this point on, there was no way to go back. There was nothing left but victory or death. Vercingetorix's early life was already over by the time open war was about to break out, even though his biggest battles were still to come. The boy who grew up with stories, feasts, and games of war was gone. There was a man there instead of him, shaped by betrayal, patience, and brutal honesty. Everything that made him who he was had been made before Caesar ever set foot in Gaul. His noble birth taught. He thought that being a leader meant having responsibilities. Oral tradition taught him that memory was more important than winning. Training as a warrior taught him how to keep going. The execution of his father taught him that honor was less important than unity. Exile taught him to be patient. Rome taught him how to plan. Fire taught him how to be in charge. Versing did not accidentally join the rebellion. He got there on purpose. Unlike previous GIC leaders who acted out of fear or pride, Vercingetorix knew when to act. He waited until fear was stronger than comfort, until it felt like the Romans were always there, until being unsure was more dangerous than fighting back. People who weren't watching thought it was sudden when he finally did something. This is what set him apart. He didn't say it would be easy to win. He promised to live, but it would cost a lot. He told Gaul to put up with pain now so he could live later. A lot of people followed him, not because they loved him, but because they trusted him. His power didn't come from blood alone anymore. It came from being consistent. He gave Gaul something that was hard to find, a land that used to be broken up into pieces that made him unavoidable. His enemies could feel it too. Roman sources say that he was not a barbarian chief who acted on impulse, but a commander who could learn, adapt, and keep order. That reputation didn't come out of nowhere. It was earned long before the swords crossed. The early life of Vercingetorix explains how he was able to bring together tribes that had been at odds with each other for a long time, why he could give orders to destroy things and people would listen, why he could be in charge without a crown in a culture that hated kings. By the When time history sees him, the foundation is already built. The rebellion that comes next is not the story of a sudden uprising. It is the end of a childhood spent under stress in a society that was falling apart while a bigger force closed in. Vercingetorix didn't come out of nowhere. He rose up from remembering, losing, and getting ready. Gaul had no other choice by that time. Long before Alexandria became the most important city on Egypt's coast, Thonis Heracleon stood guard at the mouth of the Nile, controlling the most important entry point into the realm. Every ship coming from the Mediterranean has to pass through its ports first. This alone made the city necessary. It wasn't just a port, it was Egypt's customs gate, religious threshold, and economic filter all in one. The Nile Delta was Egypt's lifeline, and Thonis Heracleon was right where the river and the sea met. Its docks were always busy, with goods coming and going, grain from the fertile interior, papyrus, linen, gold, and holy gifts all went out. Wine, olive oil, metalwork, and luxuries from other countries came in. Long before merchants could trade deeper inland, officials kept an eye on cargo, collected taxes, and enforced rules. The city was made for water. Canals take the place of streets. Carts were replaced by boats. As the city's many islands changed shape, warehouses, temples, and government buildings were built along the new channels that connected them. To a sailor who just got there, Thonis Heracleon must have felt alive, like they were floating with people and things going on all around them. Business. There was more than just economic power here. Thonis Heracleon was also a holy place. Foreign traders had to make offerings to the gods of the city before they could do business in Egypt. Temples were close to the docks, which made sure that trade started with a ritual submission. This mix of religion and government strengthened Egypt's way of looking at the world. Prosperity came from God's favor, not just making money. The city's population showed that it was a gateway. Egyptian priests lived. With Greek traders, the harbors were full of sailors, translators, tax collectors, and workers. There were some languages that were the same, mixed customs. But order was still strict. This was not a free port. It was watched, controlled, and regulated at every level. Thonis Heracleon thrived for hundreds of years because of where it was. The city was important as long as the Nile fed Egypt and the sea brought trade. It became rich, self assured, and an important part of Egypt's infrastructure. No one is building temples or warehouses. People here thought the ground would never give way. Thonis Heracleon looked like it would last forever, sitting between the river and the sea. Little did they know that the water that kept it alive was slowly getting ready to go away. There was more to Thonis Heracleon than just a city with two names. It was a city that had two different cultures at the same time. To the Egyptians, it was Thonis, a holy port that was subject to ritual law, divine authority, and the ancient rhythms of the Nile. It was Heracleion to the Greeks, a well known gateway. After Heracles, the hero they thought had once walked on its shores. People often used both names, depending on who was listening. The city's dual identity showed how unique it was at the crossroads of civilizations. Greek traders who came from the Ion didn't feel completely out of place here. They knew the name Heracleon, saw gods they knew were similar to their own, and found communities that were already used to trading with people from other cultures. In the meantime, Egyptian priests kept strict religious control, making sure that the presence of foreigners never upset the sacred order. The mixing was useful, not emotional. Egyptians put up with Greek traders because they brought Egypt things it wanted and money. The Greeks respected Egyptian rituals because they were important for trade. Religion was the language that everyone spoke. People thought that Greek gods were the same as Egyptian gods. Heracles was linked to local gods and goddesses who were known for their strength and protection. This made trade easier and fights less common. Documents and inscriptions show that Thonis Heracleon was Egypt's official international port before Alexandria was built. Foreign ships had to dock here, register their cargo, and pay fees. They could only go on after that. This gave the city a lot of power. It decided who could enter Egypt and how. This balance was clear in everyday life. Greek sailors drank in bars in Egypt. Egyptian officials learned Greek words for business. It wasn't uncommon for families to be mixed. But there were still boundaries. Egyptian sacred spaces remained. Political power stayed in the area. There was cultural exchange, but it was always watched. The two names of the city did not compete with each other. They were tools. Each one helped different groups understand the same place using ideas they were already familiar with. Thonus Heracleon was successful because it could do a lot of things at once without getting out of control. It was successful and strong because it was flexible, but it also needed stability to survive. The city did well as long as trade kept going and rituals had meaning. When those things changed, its carefully balanced world would have nothing solid to stand on but water, memory, and a name that would eventually go down with it. In Thonus Heracleon, religion wasn't just limited to quiet places of worship. It was in charge of the city's layout, rhythm, and power. Temples were not built far from places where people traded. They were built right next to harbors and canals so that the holy presence could see every arrival, every transaction, and every leaving. The most important sanctuary was for Ammon Gerb, a local version of the powerful god Ammon. This temple was huge, made of stone that would last forever, and it was protected by huge statues and sphinxes that stood guard at its entrances. To step into the city was to step into divine territory. No ship entered without passing these symbols of authority. Sacred canals linked temples to one another, making ritual processions into ceremonies that floated. Priests carried statues of gods around. The waterways on elaborate barges during festivals, reenacting myths and renewing divine favor. These events were not private. They were public performances of power, reminding inhabitants and foreigners alike who truly ruled the city. Offerings filled temple storehouses. Gold, grain, incense, and other expensive things from other countries came into holy hands. Temples were like banks. They moved money around, paid for building projects, and supported the priestly hierarchies. Religious power and control over the economy were two sides of the same coin. The architecture itself reinforced permanence. It looked like solid ground was holding up huge stone blocks. Columns rose from platforms built to resist flooding. To ancient builders, the city felt secure, protected by gods and engineering alike. Foreigners were required to participate, at least symbolically. Before trading, merchants offered gifts or paid ritual fees. This was not simple superstition, it was political theology. Egypt's wealth existed because the gods allowed it. Ignoring them invited chaos. The temples also stored records, measured water levels, and regulated calendars. They were administrative centers disguised as sacred spaces. Knowledge flowed through priests as much as power did. Ironically, this emphasis on permanence made the city vulnerable. Heavy stone structures pressed into unstable sediment, accelerating subsidence. The monuments that were supposed to keep Thonus Heracleon in place actually helped pull it down over time. Still, at its peak, the temples in the city were clear proof that God's order and people's desire to do well could live together. The river and the sea met under sacred watch, and for generations, Thonus Heracleon seemed unmovable. The gods looked like they were stuck. The water seemed obedient. No one suspected that the foundations beneath those towering sanctuaries were slowly dissolving, grain by grain, preparing to erase a sacred city from the surface of the world. Thonis Heracleon did not become powerful by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship that entered Egypt through the Nile Delta was required to stop here, and every stop generated revenue. Taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and inspections turned movement into money. There was always something going on in the harbor. Ships from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and the rest of the Mediterranean docked next to Egyptian barges that were full of stone and grain. Cranes and laborers worked along quays built of wood and stone. Warehouses rose close to the water so goods could be transferred quickly before tides or currents shifted. Trade was regulated tightly. Officials recorded cargo, weighed goods, and enforced restrictions. Certain items could not pass inland without permission. Smuggling was punished severely. Thonis Heracleon was both a marketplace and a checkpoint. Ritual framed every transaction. Before they unloaded, the captains gave gifts to the gods of the area. In addition to taxes, people also paid sacred fees. These actions strengthened Egypt's power and reminded outsiders that trade here was never just about money. The city's importance grew because of its annual festivals. Holy processions drew crowds from across the delta. Divine statues were carried on barges through canals accompanied by music, incense, and chanting. These events blended religion and spectacle, reinforcing loyalty and attracting visitors. Wealth concentrated in visible ways. Colossal statues, decorated shrines, and finely carved reliefs displayed prosperity. Coins and imported luxuries circulated widely. Even ordinary laborers experienced the city's abundance through festivals and temple distributions. Yet prosperity bred dependence. Thonisaricleon's identity was tied almost entirely to its function as a gateway. It did not diversify its role. As long as trade flowed through it, the city thrived. If routes changed, relevance would vanish. This vulnerability was invisible at first. For centuries, nothing challenged the city's position. The Nile continued to flow, ships continued to arrive, temples continued to receive offerings. But there was pressure building below the surface. Sediment shifted, foundations strained, and far to the west, Alexandria had not yet been founded, but the conditions for its rise were already forming. Thonis Heracleon stood at the peak of its influence, wealthy, sacred, and indispensable. It did not realize that its greatest strength, control of trade, would one day be transferred elsewhere, leaving its temples, harbors, and rituals without purpose, standing on ground that could no longer support them. Thonis Heracleon did not collapse because of invasion or sudden catastrophe. It failed quietly from below. The city was built on layers of soft Nile silt, sediment deposited over centuries by shifting river channels. This ground looked solid, but it behaved more like a sponge than stone. The city lasted as long as things stayed the same. The land itself started to betray it when they changed. Earthquakes in the eastern Mediterranean periodically shook the delta. Even mild tremors had serious consequences here. Waterlogged soil lost strength. a process now known as liquefaction. Buildings that had stood for generations suddenly tilted, cracked, or sank. Foundations slid sideways. Stone blocks shifted out of alignment. Canals widened where the ground collapsed inward. Rising sea levels compounded the problem. As the Mediterranean slowly encroached inland, salt water seeped into the delta's sediments, weakening them further. Flooding became more frequent. Neighborhoods closest to the coast suffered first. Streets became permanent waterways. People left their homes, and then they were eaten. The heaviness of monumental architecture made things worse. Temples and statues pressed downward relentlessly. Structures designed to last forever accelerated their own destruction. When the ground softened, heavy stone had nowhere to go but down. The process was gradual but relentless. One generation adapted, the next rebuilt. Canals were rooted, platforms were raised, repairs were constant, expensive, and increasingly ineffective. Each fix bought time, not stability. People noticed. Priests interpreted disasters as divine warnings. It was hard for officials to keep up with infrastructure. Trade slowed down because ports weren't always safe. Ships stayed away from shifting channels that were shallower. Confidence eroded alongside the land. There was no single moment when Thonis Heracleon was declared doomed. The city, on the other hand, faded in stages. Areas were abandoned quietly. Rituals moved elsewhere. Administration shifted inland. What remained stood increasingly isolated, surrounded by water and silence. Nature did not erase the city violently, it absorbed it. Stones slipped beneath mud, statues toppled and disappeared. Temples sank intact, preserving their shape even as they vanished. By the time the final structures went under, Thonis Heracleon was already a shadow of itself. The city that once controlled Egypt's gateway had become an inconvenience, then a memory. The ground had spoken slowly, patiently, and without drama, and eventually it won. As Thonis Heracleon weakened, the world around it changed. The city's decline did not occur in isolation. Political power, trade routes, and strategic priorities shifted, leaving the once essential port increasingly sidelined. The most decisive blow came not from nature, but from replacement. In the late 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great founded Alexandria to the west. Unlike Thonis Heracleon, Alexandria was built on firmer ground and designed with long-term expansion in mind. Its harbors were deep, protected, and better suited to large fleets. From the beginning, it was meant to be a capital, not merely a checkpoint. Trade followed stability. Merchants preferred reliable docks and predictable administration. Royal support came to Alexandria, bringing with it artists, scholars, and government officials. Customs duties were moved. After power came religious prestige, and temples that used to be important in Thornonis Heracleon lost their power. The old port had a hard time competing. Its harbors silted. Repairs grew more expensive. Each earthquake or flood pushed the city further toward irrelevance. Administrators relocated, priests followed, rituals that once anchored, identity moved inland or westward. This was not a dramatic abandonment. Families left gradually, warehouses emptied, temples fell silent, boats bypassed familiar channels. What had been the gateway to Egypt became a backwater, then a hazard. Nature finished what politics began. Flooding erased remaining neighborhoods. Canals merged with the sea. Buildings collapsed quietly beneath the waterline. The city slipped beneath the delta with no ceremony. By the early medieval period, Tonus Heracleion was gone. Its name survived in texts, but its location was lost. Maps showed only water. Alexandria was the best, and its libraries and ports made people forget about older ports. Thonus Heracleon's fate was sealed by the rise of Alexandria. Not only did it replace the city, it also made it unnecessary. What was left was a sunken shell that was protected by mud and silence. It was waiting for a future that didn't remember the port that used to control Egypt's entrance to the world. Once Thonus Heracleion disappeared beneath the waters of the Nile Delta, it did not leave ruins behind for travelers to wander over. It left nothing visible at all, no broken columns on land, no half-buried walls, only water, mud, and shifting currents. Over time, this absence transformed the city from history into legend. Ancient writers mentioned Thonus and Heracleon in passing. Herodotus described a great port at Egypt's entrance. Other sources referenced temples, rituals, and foreign merchants, but without physical remains. Later scholars argued over whether these accounts talked about one city, a few cities, or something that was more of a symbol than a real place. Some people thought Thonus Heracleon was too much. Some people thought it had been mixed up with Canopus or Alexandria. The debate came to a halt without proof. They drew new maps. The city stopped being talked about seriously. By the time of modern times, it was mostly just a footnote, something that was interesting but not important. Local fishermen sometimes talked about how nets got stuck on something solid, or how anchors got stuck on stone shapes under the water. But the delta is full of trash, and these kinds of stories don't usually go very far. Mud quickly covered everything. The Nile does a good job of forgetting its past. The cities stayed the same for more than 1,000 years, buried under layers of silt. Statues stayed where they fell. The temples stayed up, but their columns slowly sank and didn't fall down. The ships gently settled on the floor of the harbor, with their cargo still on board. Underwater, time moved more slowly. Ironically, being underwater kept things safe that being abandoned couldn't. Not like cities that were looted or. Thonus Heracleion was sealed after it was taken apart. No later builders used its stone again. No conquerors took down its temples. The city was not ruined, it was put in storage. Historians were unsure because of this lack. People thought that civilizations would leave marks on the land. A city that important should have left something behind. It was strange that there was no noise, and yet the quiet was real. Thonus Heracleion didn't disappear because it never existed in the first place. It disappeared because it had completely sunk and was swallowed by the same waters that once made it strong. The sea kept its secret for a long time. While history moved on, sure that the city was more myth than reality. That illusion wouldn't last forever. The myth finally started to break down in the late 20th century. With new technology for surveying underwater, it was possible to search the muddy seabed of the Nile Delta in an organized way instead of at random. In 1996, a group led by French underwater archaeologist Frank Godiot started scanning places that had long been thought to hold something old, but few thought they would find an entire. A city would ever be found. What came out was not a broken ruin, but a city that was stuck in the process of falling apart. There were huge stone blocks, broken columns, and statues bigger than any fishing debris could explain under several meters of water and thick layers of silt. Sonar maps showed the locations of streets, canals, and harbor basins. It wasn't a coincidence. It was planning for the city. When the divers went down, the scale became clear. Huge statues of gods and kings lay on their sides, their faces still whole. Half buried sphinxes lay in the mud, but clear. Temple walls stayed where they fell, thanks to sediment that kept them from eroding. The old harbor was full of shipwrecks. In the end, more than 70 ships were found. Some were carrying cargo, and others were probably ceremonial barges. Anchors, ropes, and wooden holes told the story of a port that had stopped working. Trade hadn't slowly died out here, it had been stopped. Inscriptions proved who the city was. Names of gods, kings, and places were the same as in old texts. Thonis and Heracleon showed up. Together, they ended a long running historical argument. The famous port was real, and it was exactly where ancient texts said it would be. Archaeologists were shocked by the find. Thonis Heracleon was in great shape, unlike land sites that had been looted for hundreds of years. The statues had fallen, but they hadn't broken. Temples had fallen down, but they hadn't been taken apart. Even fragile things lived in mud that didn't have much oxygen. Every season of digging uncovered more gold ceremonial items, coins from different time periods, and everyday tools left behind. Where they landed, there was no violence in the last moments of the city. They were silent, sudden enough to stop activity, but not so sudden that it stops. The discovery changed Egypt's coastal history for historians. Thonis Heracleon was no longer just a rumor. It was a chapter that had been lost but was found almost whole. The city had been under the water for more than 1,000 years. Now it had come back to life, not to live again, but to speak again, stone by stone, from the seabed where it had waited patiently for memory to catch up. Thonis Heracleon is not important just because it was lost and found. Its real worth is in what it shows about how civilizations grow, change, and then fade away without anyone noticing. This was not a city that war wiped out. It was important, central, wealthy, and holy, but it went away without much of a fight. The city shows how geography can affect power. Water, trade routes, and religious authority helped Thonis Heracleon grow. The same environment that kept it alive also killed it. As the land became softer and the sea levels rose, wealth and tradition didn't keep them safe. The gods were worshipped, the taxes were paid, and the rituals were done. But nature didn't make a deal. It also shows how weak memory can be. For hundreds of years, scholars weren't sure the city existed because there was nothing left on land. History favored what was visible. Thonus Heraclean reminds us that being absent doesn't mean being unimportant. Whole worlds can disappear without leaving a mark. The city changes how we think about how ancient Egypt interacted with the Mediterranean. It shows that cultural exchange wasn't just a one time thing, it was a regular thing. Greeks and Egyptians interacted every day, but there were strict rules about how they could do so. Globalization isn't new, it is very old. Also, there is a warning here. Thonus Heraclean didn't fall apart quickly enough to make people want to change things. It was easy to put off and manageable as it got worse. Repairs were done, and then changes were made. No one disaster made people leave. It was already too late when it became clear that they had to leave. Underwater preservation gives us a very special gift, a city that hasn't changed over time. What we see is not history that has been rebuilt, but life that has been cut short, tools that were left behind, ships still moored, statues that fell where they were. It is archaeology that doesn't have too much printing. Thonus Heracleon is still mostly unexplored and lies under shallow water today. The silt has sealed off most of the city. What we have found is only a small part of what is out there. The sunken city teaches us to be humble. Civilizations don't always end in war or fire. They go down sometimes, quietly, only remembered when technology and curiosity finally catch up. For hundreds of years, Thonus Heracleon was the ruler of Egypt's gateway. Now it lies beneath it, preserved not by stone or memory, but by water, waiting patiently beneath the delta. This reminds us how easily things that seem permanent can change.